The Stone Age was a long time ago. It lasted for over 2 million years. The Stone Age began when humans first started using stones as tools and ended when people learned how to smelt metals like iron and copper. Most of us would probably agree that life during the Stone Age would have been tough. You had to hunt for your food and make your own clothes. There were no roads, no electronics, and no air conditioning. And most people lived in constant fear of being attacked by wild animals or rival tribes. But it might not have been all that bad if you were gay in the Stone Age. Life as a gay man during the Stone Age would have been much more peaceful than life as a straight man. And here's why. During the Stone Age, men were worth much more than women. In most societies today, this is illegal and wrong. But back then, having more men was a good thing. The more men you had, the more likely you were to successfully go on a hunting trip. More men also meant more warriors to protect the tribe from attack. Because of this, the birth of a baby boy was celebrated with great joy, and baby boys were often given the name Happy. If you were born a female in the Stone Age, your job would be to collect berries and nuts and take care of the children while the men went out and hunted. Women were considered property and were usually married off to the highest bidder. So if you were gay in the Stone Age, you would probably live a much happier life. You wouldn't have to worry about getting married or having children because no one would ever expect you to do those things. And since you weren't straight, you didn't have to go out and hunt with the other men. Hunting could be dangerous, and most hunters died before they reached the age of 40. If you were gay in the Stone Age, you'd probably spend most of your time making tools and weapons for the tribe. This would be much less dangerous than hunting, and you'd probably live a long life. Life for a gay man in the Stone Age wouldn't have been so bad. But what about a gay woman? If you were a lesbian in the Stone Age, your life would have been very difficult. There were no female hunters and no female warriors. Your job would have been to gather food and take care of the children. This might have been okay if you were a straight woman, but as a lesbian, you wouldn't want to take care of anyone else's children but your own. And since no one would ever expect you to have children, you would be considered an outcast. Chances are you would be kicked out of your tribe and left to die. Now let's say you were a gay man who lived through the entire Stone Age. You were born around 2 million years ago and lived until the Iron Age began around 4000 BC. How old would you be at the end of the Stone Age? Well, the average life expectancy during the Stone Age was 35 years old. But since you were a gay man, you probably lived much longer because you didn't go hunting. Let's assume you lived to be 60 years old. That means you lived through the entire Stone Age. It's time to play a game. Do you know what? Pause this video right now and write down on a piece of paper what you think the population of the world was when you were born. Also, write down what you think the population of the world was when you died. Now look at the answers on your paper and compare them to these. Even though you had a pretty cushy life as a gay man in the Stone Age, it still wouldn't have been all that great. When the Iron Age began, people started living in cities and forming governments. But if you were a gay man in the Stone Age, you would probably be fine with all of these changes. You were used to making your own way in the world. In fact, you might even be excited about the changes taking place. Maybe you'd become the leader of your city, or even the king of a small country. Life during the Stone Age would have been difficult for everyone, but especially for straight men. If you were a guy back then, you had to be tough. You had to hunt and fight, and sometimes that meant killing other people. But if you were gay, you probably spent your time doing something less dangerous like making tools and weapons. Life as a gay man in the Stone Age wasn't all that bad. But life as a straight man was miserable. It's important to remember that not all Stone Age tribes were the same. Some were nomadic and constantly on the move, while others lived in permanent settlements. Some tribes hunted and gathered food, while others kept livestock. Some tribes were warlike, while others were peaceful. Life during the Stone Age would have been different depending on which tribe you lived with. But no matter where you lived, if you were gay, you probably had it better than straight people. That being said, there is absolutely no evidence that homosexuality was more common during the Stone Age than it is today. Homosexuality has probably always existed, but we only know about it because we found some cave paintings depicting two men kissing. Of course, this doesn't prove anything because two guys could have painted that picture for any number of reasons. They might have been trying to depict a father showing his son affection, or maybe they were trying to show how close they were as friends. We just don't know. This brings us to another point. We don't know exactly what life was like in the Stone Age. All we have to go on are the few artifacts that have survived and the bones of people who lived back then. We can learn a lot from these things, but it's impossible to know everything. For example, we don't know if Stone Age people believed that homosexuality was wrong. Maybe they didn't care. Maybe they didn't even have a word for gay or straight. Maybe they were too busy trying to survive to worry about things like that. The truth is, we'll never know what life was like in the Stone Age. We can only guess. But one thing is for sure. If you were gay back then, you probably had it better than straight people. A wild rumor has recently started spreading among archaeologists that human beings may have had a term for homosexuality as far back as 20,000 years ago. This would suggest that sexuality is more than just a social construct, and that there are biological imperatives baked into our DNA. And that's a massive claim with enormous implications if true. But what did these long-dead people actually call it? Did they use the term gay? Of course not. The word gay first appeared in the English language during the 16th century, so there was no way they were using that term. So, let's take a look at what the actual evidence is for this rumor. There were no labels, just behavior. First off, nobody knows what they would have called it because, well, nobody was around to ask. However, there is one important thing to keep in mind while evaluating this rumor. The people who lived during the Stone Age didn't think about sex in the same way we do today. They didn't categorize people based on their sexual orientation. That wasn't a thing. It's a modern concept. Even in the recent past, most societies throughout history didn't categorize people by their sexual orientation. They only really started doing so in the 19th century. At that time, being gay was seen as something shameful and wrong. The words used to describe it came from the field of medicine, which ultimately gave us the terms we still use today. For example, homosexuality itself first appeared in the scientific literature in 1869, when it was used by a scientist who also coined the term heterosexuality. Prior to that, same-sex relationships were often described as intimate, improper, or unnatural. So if the people of the Stone Age didn't label homosexual behavior in any way, how can we even say that they engaged in it? Well, we can't really. We can only point to specific behaviors and then speculate that those behaviors may have been related to homosexuality. In other words, we can't prove that they thought of it the way we do, but we can see if they behaved in ways that we associate with homosexuality. Evidence of same-sex behavior in prehistoric times. Now, there have been a few studies suggesting that there was some form of same-sex behavior in prehistoric times. Perhaps the most compelling of these studies comes from the island of Crete. Archaeologists unearthed a burial site consisting of two men who died at roughly the same time. One of them was older, and the other was significantly younger. Now, this isn't proof of anything by itself, since both could have been straight and just happened to die within a couple of months of each other. But that's not all that was found. They also discovered another burial nearby with two young men who were similarly close in age, and yet another pair of male burials with two older men who were again close in age. This suggests that the younger men were partners of the older men. Of course, we don't know that for sure. There's a possibility that they were family members. But the fact that we see pairs of males buried together in 3 separate instances strongly suggests that they may have been lovers. However, there is another intriguing detail about these burials. All of them had jewelry and ornaments made out of seashells. These ornaments weren't found anywhere else at the site, and it turns out that this particular type of ornament was typically given to women in these cultures, not men. So what exactly does this all mean? Who knows? The truth is, that all we can say is that these men were buried together with female ornaments. And we can't know for sure why that was. Same-sex behavior exists in nature too. Okay, but what if we could find something that's a bit stronger than male-on-male burials? Well, it turns out that we have. During the Upper Paleolithic era, cavemen created all kinds of art depicting various animals. In some cases, they carved phalluses onto these animals. Now, you might be wondering why they would do this. After all, there wasn't much anatomical reason to depict animal penises. And that's probably true. They weren't trying to depict their anatomy. Instead, they were likely trying to depict their sexual prowess. In other words, they carved big phalluses onto animals to make them look more masculine. Now, that may sound ridiculous, but many anthropologists believe that this was a common motif in ancient art. It was a way to show that an animal was sexually mature and capable of reproduction. And if that's true, then that may have been a way for cavemen to express their own masculinity through similar depictions. Cave paintings of humans almost always depicted people in profile, likely to show their muscular physique, but sometimes they depicted people head-on. And when they did that, they would draw the person with an exaggerated crotch. The theory is that this was a way to emphasize their masculinity. Much like athletes today will flex their muscles after scoring a touchdown or hitting a home run. You were still expected to reproduce. But if the cavemen of the Stone Age had a way of expressing their masculinity, does that mean they still expected their men to reproduce? The answer is yes. Male-on-male and female-on-female intercourse wasn't taboo in most societies throughout history, but it was typically frowned upon if the act didn't result in procreation. Now, back in the days of the Neanderthals, this wasn't an issue. It was difficult to tell whether or not a person was gay since anyone who had sex with the same gender could potentially reproduce. But things became more complicated as time went on and different societies developed. As we mentioned earlier, people began to view same-sex relationships as immoral in the 1800s. And this led to the creation of sodomy laws. Sodomy, in case you weren't aware, refers to sexual acts between people of the same sex or between a person and an animal. And these laws were designed to crack down on people who engaged in these activities. However, these laws weren't always strictly enforced. Sometimes they were only enforced when someone's behavior was seen as threatening the social order. For example, during World War I, men who were drafted into the army were often forced to live in close quarters with other men. This led to a significant increase in the number of sodomy convictions. Soldiers who were caught engaging in homosexual behavior were seen as weak and unfit for service. And so, they were targeted by the military police. You may have played a different role. Today, you can come out as gay and identify yourself however you want. But in the Stone Age, it would not have been as simple as coming out to your parents and telling them you're gay. In fact, you probably wouldn't have been able to identify yourself as gay at all. As we've already covered, people back then didn't organize their thoughts around sexuality. Therefore, there was no real term for it. And even if there was, it probably would have been a source of shame rather than pride. So if you were gay during the Stone Age, you probably wouldn't have been able to live your life in the open. And you certainly couldn't have identified yourself as gay. Your life would have been extremely difficult. But if you were lucky, you might have been able to play a different role in your community. Some anthropologists theorize that the first human societies were matrilineal, meaning that they traced their lineage through their mothers rather than their fathers. And since there was no real way of knowing who your father was, it would have been easy to claim that your mother was your father as well. This may sound insane, but remember, they wouldn't have been thinking in terms of sexuality. They would have simply seen themselves as taking on a different kind of parent role. And this isn't a far-fetched theory. Anthropologists have found evidence of lesbian couples raising children together. There are examples of this in prehistoric Europe, Africa, and North America. Now, obviously, that doesn't prove that they were gay. But it is pretty strong evidence that people back then weren't as hung up on traditional gender roles as we are today. Other experts disagree, arguing that there's no evidence that these women were anything other than sisters, or perhaps cousins. And they argue that the children in question were likely conceived through heterosexual intercourse. So there's no consensus among experts yet. But one thing's for sure, if you were gay during the Stone Age, you wouldn't have been able to identify yourself as such. Your sexuality would have been defined by your behavior, and if you were lucky, that behavior would have been accepted by your community. But if it wasn't, well, things could get very bad very quickly. It's no secret that life was very different back in the Stone Age. We had to deal with harsh weather without shelter or clothing made from anything more than animal skins. We were constantly at risk of being injured or killed by wild animals, and even our own primitive tools. And we spent our days trying to find food, either by hunting or gathering what we could find in the wild. It's hard to say whether life was better then or now, but one thing is for sure. If you were gay in the Stone Age, it would have been a much, much more difficult existence. Before we start, we want to remind you that this is just a fun exploration of what may have happened if someone were gay in the Stone Age. We realize that there's no way we could possibly know what it was like, but we're just having a little bit of fun here. So, with that said, let's take a look at 4 things that would have happened if you were gay back then. But acceptance likely varied greatly. If you're gay today, chances are you felt alienated or ostracized by your family, friends, or society at large. Even in today's modern world, there's still a lot of discrimination against people in the LGBTQ community. And while things are certainly getting better, there's still a long way to go. But did you know that discrimination has been around for thousands of years? In fact, ancient Greek and Roman texts contain the first known written accounts of homosexuality. However, they also contain some pretty negative views about it. In ancient Rome, same-sex relationships between men were accepted as long as the man initiating the relationship was older and unmarried. But once he was married, his only acceptable sexual partner was a woman. In fact, Roman law prohibited any form of sexual relations between men of the same sex when both partners were over the age of 14. The Greeks weren't much better. While Greek culture was significantly more accepting of male-male relationships, it was generally expected that these relationships were used to turn young men into proper adults. This means that the younger partner had to prove himself to be strong and masculine in order to complete the transition into adulthood. And this often came at the expense of the older partner, who was usually exploited for labor. To make matters worse, women were largely excluded from ancient Greek culture, and this included their sexuality. They had little access to education, and most of what we know about their culture comes from stories written by men. All this is to say that even in ancient times, there were plenty of people who accepted homosexuality, and there were plenty of people who didn't. So if you were gay back then, whether you were able to live a happy and healthy life would have depended largely on where you lived and who you lived with. Survival always came first. Today, there are many different ways to come out as gay. Some people do it through subtle means, while others prefer to be more open about it. And while it might be easy to imagine our Stone Age ancestors coming out to their caveman counterparts, the reality is much more grim. For most people today, being gay is simply part of who we are. And while there may be times where we choose to hide it, it's not normally because of fear of persecution or violence. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case during the Stone Age. Back then, survival was always the top priority. And if you weren't pulling your weight in the group, you were put out on your own. And chances are, you wouldn't survive for long. There are a few reasons for this. First of all, your tribe relied on you for your unique skills and contributions. Every member of the group had to pull their weight in order for the tribe to flourish. If you were sick or injured, other members of the group had to take care of you. If you were a hunter, your job was to bring home food for the tribe. If you were a gatherer, you had to bring back enough food for everyone. And if you weren't contributing, you were seen as a liability. Secondly, the Stone Age was a dangerous time to be alive. Wild animals roamed freely, and there were no laws to protect you from your fellow humans. In fact, it was common for tribes to go to war with each other. This meant that every member of the group had to be on their A-game at all times. And if you couldn't contribute to the group or defend it, you were seen as a liability. Finally, resources were scarce. There was never enough food or water for everyone, which meant that groups were constantly on the move. This made it difficult for anyone to settle down and build a permanent home, and it meant that everyone had to be ready to move at a moment's notice. With all of this in mind, it's easy to see why a gay person would have been seen as a liability back then. Being gay meant that you weren't interested in having children, which was the ultimate goal of every member of the tribe. You weren't contributing to the group. And if you were kicked out of the tribe, you wouldn't be able to survive on your own. Love still existed. One of the biggest myths about the Stone Age is that people back then were nothing more than savage beasts. We often imagine them as violent and uncivilized, but the truth is much more nuanced. Yes, life was difficult back then, but people still found time to have fun. They still formed close bonds with each other, and they still found love. In fact, archaeologists have discovered several pieces of art that depict couples holding hands or embracing. So while it's true that life was much more difficult back then, it wasn't all bad. People still managed to find happiness and love despite the difficult circumstances. As mentioned earlier, ancient Roman culture was actually fairly accepting of homosexual relationships. However, this acceptance only applied to men. Women were largely excluded from Roman society, and their sexuality was largely ignored. However, this wasn't the case everywhere. The newer people of South Sudan are known for their unique views on gender and sexuality. In their culture, there's no distinction between male and female, gay and straight. Instead, they believe that everyone has the potential to be both male and female, and they encourage their children to explore their sexuality. This means that a gay person living among the newer people would have likely been accepted and celebrated. Unfortunately, this is not the norm in most of the world. And if you were gay in the Stone Age, you would have likely faced persecution and violence. This is especially true if you were living in a tribe that valued heterosexuality above all else. But it's important to remember that not all tribes were like this. There were plenty of Stone Age tribes that were more accepting of homosexuality, and you might have been able to find refuge with one of them. You probably wouldn't have been out, but you might not have been alone. In today's world, there's a wide spectrum of sexual orientations and gender identities. Some people identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer. Others identify as asexual or aromantic, and still others identify as two-spirited, which is a term used by some Native American cultures to describe those who have both male and female spirits. But back in the Stone Age, things were much different. In fact, we don't even know how many different sexual orientations and gender identities there were back then. That's because humans don't have the ability to go back in time and ask people about their personal lives. So everything we know about the Stone Age is based on the archaeological evidence. And unfortunately, the archaeological record doesn't tell us much about people's personal lives. This means that we can't say for sure how many gay people there were in the Stone Age. However, we do have some clues. For example, we know that some Stone Age tribes had two-spirit people, which is a term used by some Native American cultures to describe those who have both male and female spirits. We also know that there were likely plenty of people in the Stone Age who engaged in same-sex behavior, even if they didn't identify as gay. So while we can't say for sure how many gay people there were in the Stone Age, it's safe to say that there were probably quite a few. If you were gay in the Stone Age, you probably wouldn't have been out. That's because being gay was likely seen as taboo and you could have been kicked out of your tribe. But you might not have been alone. There were likely plenty of other gay people in the Stone Age, even if they didn't identify that way. So what do you think? How do you think life would have been if you were gay in the Stone Age? Let us know in the comments below.